The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amidst the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. Lord Henry went out to the garden and found Dorian Gray burying his face in the great cool lilac blossoms, feverishly drinking in their perfume as if it had been wine. He came close to him and put his hand upon his shoulder. "You are quite right to do that," he murmured. "Nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul." Dorian Gray frowned and turned his head away. He could not help liking the tall, graceful young man who was standing by him. His romantic olive-colored face and worn expression interested him. There was something in his low, languid voice that was absolutely fascinating. But he felt afraid of him, and ashamed of being afraid. Why had it been left for a stranger to reveal him to himself? And yet what was there to be afraid of? He was not a schoolboy or a girl. It was absurd to be frightened. "Let us go and sit in the shade," said Lord Henry. "Parker has brought out the drinks, and if you stay any longer in this glare, you'll be quite spoiled, and Basil will never paint you again. You really must not allow yourself to become sunburnt. It would be unbecoming." "What can it matter?" cried Dorian Gray, laughing, as he sat down on the seat at the end of the garden. "It should matter everything to you, Mr. Gray." "Why?" "Because you have the most marvelous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having." "I don't feel that, Lord Henry." "No, you don't feel it now. Some day, when you are old and wrinkled and ugly, when thought has seared your forehead with its lines and passion branded your lips with its hideous fires, you will feel it. You will feel it terribly. Now, wherever you go, you charm the world. Will it always be so? You have a wonderfully beautiful face, Mr. Gray. Don't frown. You have. And beauty is a form of genius. It's higher, indeed, than genius. You smile. Ah, when you have lost it, you won't smile. Youth. There is absolutely nothing in the world but youth." Dorian Gray listened, open-eyed and wondering. A spray of lilac fell from his hand upon the gravel. A furry bee came and buzzed round it for a moment. Suddenly the painter, Basil Hallward, appeared at the door of the studio and made staccato signs for them to come in. They rose up and sauntered down the walk together. "You are glad to have met me, Mr. Gray," said Lord Henry, looking at him. "Yes, I am glad now. I wonder, shall I always be glad?" "Always? That is a dreadful word. It makes me shudder when I hear it. Women are so fond of using it. They spoil every romance by trying to make it last forever. It is a meaningless word, too. The only difference between a caprice and a lifelong passion is that the caprice lasts a little longer." As they entered the studio, Dorian Gray put his hand upon Lord Henry's arm. "In that case, let our friendship be a caprice," he murmured. Hallward looked for a long time at Dorian Gray, and then for a long time at the picture, biting the end of one of his huge brushes and frowning. "It is quite finished," he cried at last, and stooping down, he wrote his name in long vermilion letters on the left-hand corner of the canvas. Lord Henry came over and examined the picture. "My dear fellow, I congratulate you most warmly. It is the finest portrait of modern times. Mr. Gray, come over and look at yourself." Dorian passed listlessly in front of his picture and turned towards it. When he saw it, he drew back, and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes, as if he had recognized himself for the first time. The sense of his own beauty came on him like a revelation. He had never felt it before. And now, as he stood gazing at the shadow of his own loveliness, the full reality of Lord Henry's description flashed across him. Yes, there would be a day when his face would be wrinkled and weazened, his eyes dim and colorless, the grace of his figure broken and deformed. The life that was to make his soul would mar his body. He would become dreadful, hideous, and uncouth. As he thought of it, A sharp pang of pain struck through him like a knife and made each delicate fibre of his nature quiver. His eyes deepened into amethyst, and across them came a mist of tears. He felt as if a hand of ice had been laid on his heart. "Don't you like it?" said Hallward at last, stung a little by the lad's silence. "Oh, if it were only the other way," cried Dorian. "If the picture could change, and I could be always what I am now. Why did you paint it? It will mock me some day. Mock me horribly." The hot tears welled into his eyes. Flinging himself on the divan, he buried his face in the cushions as though he was praying. "This is your doing, Harry," said the painter bitterly. Lord Henry shrugged his shoulders. "It is the real Dorian Gray, that is all. It is not. If it is not, what have I to do with it? Harry, I can't quarrel with my two best friends at once, but between you both, you have made me hate the finest piece of work I've ever done, and I will destroy it." With a stifled sob, the lad leaped from the couch. "Don't, Basil, don't. It would be murder." "I'm glad you appreciate my work at last, Dorian. I never thought you would." "Appreciate it? I am in love with it, Basil." "It is part of myself, I feel that." "Well, as soon as you are dry, you shall be varnished and framed and sent home, and then you can do what you like with yourself." And he walked across the room and rang the bell for tea. "You will have tea, of course, Dorian, and so will you, Harry? Or do you object to such simple pleasures?" "I adore simple pleasures," said Lord Henry. "They are the last refuge of the complex." One afternoon, a month later, Dorian Gray was reclining in a luxurious armchair in the little library of Lord Henry's house in Mayfair. Lord Henry had not yet come in. He was always late on principle, his principle being that punctuality is the thief of time. So the lad was looking rather sulky as with listless fingers he turned over the pages of an elaborately illustrated edition of Manolesco. At last he heard a step outside, and the door opened. "How late you are, Harry," he murmured. "I'm afraid it is not Harry, Mr. Gray." He glanced quickly round and rose to his feet. "I beg your pardon, I thought. You thought it was my husband. It is only his wife. You must let me introduce myself. I know you quite well by your photographs. I think my husband has got 17 of them." "Not 17, Lady Henry." "Well, 18 then, and I saw you with him the other night at the opera. But here is Harry. Harry, I came in to look for you to ask you something. I forget what it was. And I found Mr. Gray here. He's been most pleasant. I'm so glad I've seen him." "I'm charmed, my love, quite charmed," said Lord Henry. "So sorry I'm late, Dorian. I went to look after a piece of old brocade in Water Street and had to bargain for hours for it. Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing." "I'm afraid I must be going," exclaimed Lady Henry. "I've promised to drive with the Duchess. Goodbye, Mr. Gray. Goodbye, Harry. You are dining out, I suppose. So am I. Perhaps I shall see you at Lady Thornbury's." "I dare say, my dear," said Lord Henry. She flitted out of the room, leaving a faint odour of frangipani. Then he lit a cigarette and flung himself down on the sofa. "Never marry a woman with straw-coloured hair, Dorian. They are so sentimental." "But I like sentimental people." "Never marry at all, Dorian. Men marry because they are tired, women because they are curious. Both are disappointed." "I don't think I'm likely to marry, Henry. I'm too much in love." "Who are you in love with?" "With an actress," said Dorian Gray, blushing. Lord Henry shrugged his shoulders. "That is a rather commonplace debut." "You would not say so if you saw her, Harry." "Who is she?" "Her name is Sybil Vane." "Never heard of her." "Well, no one has. People will some day, however. She is a genius." "My dear boy, no woman is a genius. Women represent the triumph of matter over mind, just as men represent the triumph of mind over morals. There are only 5 women in London worth talking to, and 2 of these can't be admitted into decent society." "Harry, your views terrify me." "Don't be afraid. There are exquisite things in store for you. This girl is merely the beginning." "Do you think my nature so shallow?" "No, I think your nature so deep." "How do you mean?" "My dear boy, the people who love only once in their lives are really the shallow people. Faithfulness. I must analyze it some day. The passion for property is in it. There are many things that we would throw away if we were not afraid that others might pick them up. But I don't want to interrupt you. Go on with your story." "Well, one evening about 3 weeks ago, I found myself seated in a horrid little private box with a vulgar drop scene staring me in the face like a third-rate wedding cake. It was Romeo and Juliet. I must admit that I was rather annoyed at the idea of seeing Shakespeare done in such a wretched hole of a place. Romeo was a stout, elderly gentleman with corked eyebrows and a figure like a beer barrel. But Juliet, Harry, imagine a girl, 17 years of age, with a little flower-like face. She was the loveliest thing I'd ever seen in my life. I tell you, Harry, I could hardly see this girl for the mist of tears that came across me. And her voice, I never heard such a voice. It was very low, with deep, mellow notes. You know how a voice can stir one? Your voice and the voice of Sybil Vane are two things that I shall never forget. Harry, I do love her. She's everything to me in life. Night after night I go to see her play. I have seen her in every age and in every costume. Ordinary women never appeal to one's imagination. But an actress, how different an actress is. Harry, why didn't you tell me? Because I've loved so many of them, Dorian. Oh, yes, horrid people with dyed hair and painted faces. Don't run down dyed hair and painted faces. There is an extraordinary charm in them sometimes. But when did you first speak to Miss Sybil Vane? The third night. She'd been playing Rosalind. I could not help going round. She was so shy and so gentle. She seemed quite unconscious of her power. I think we were both rather nervous. She said quite simply to me, "You look like a prince. I must call you Prince Charming." On my word, Dorian, Miss Sybil knows how to pay compliments. You don't understand her, Harry. She regarded me merely as a person in a play. She knows nothing of life. Tonight she is Imogen, and tomorrow night she will be Juliet. When is she Sybil Vane? Never. I congratulate you. How horrid you are. She's all the great heroines in the world in one. My God, Harry, how I worship her. I want you and Basil to come with me some night and see her act. You are certain to acknowledge her genius. Well, what night shall we go? Let us fix tomorrow. She plays Juliet tomorrow. All right. Bristol at 8 o'clock, and I will get Basil. Not 8, Harry, please. 6:30. You must see her in the first act where she meets Romeo. 6:30? What an hour. It would be like having a meat tea or reading an English novel. When Dorian left the room, Lord Henry's heavy eyelids drooped, and he began to think. He was conscious, and the thought brought a gleam of pleasure into his brown, agate eyes, that it was through certain words of his, musical words said with musical utterance, that Dorian Gray's soul had turned to this white girl and bowed in worship before her. It was no matter how it all ended, or was destined to end. He was like one of those gracious figures in a pageant or a play, whose joys seem to be remote from one, but whose sorrows stir one's sense of beauty, and whose wounds are like red roses. He began to wonder whether we could ever make psychology so absolute a science that each little spring of life would be revealed to us. As it was, we always misunderstood ourselves, and rarely understood others. Experience was merely the name men gave to their mistakes. All that is really demonstrated was that our future would be the same as our past, and that the sin we had done once do many times, and with joy. He got up and looked out into the set had smitten into scarlet gold. The panes glowed. The sky above was like a faded rose. He thought of his friend's young, fiery-colored life and wondered how it was all going to end. When he arrived home about 12:30, he saw a telegram lying on the hall table. He opened it and found it was from Dorian Gray. It was to tell him that he was engaged to be married to Sybil Vane. For some reason or other, the house was crowded that night, and a manager who met them at the door escorted them to their box with a sort of pompous humility, waving his fat jeweled hands and talking at the top of his voice. "What a place to find one's divinity in," said Lord Henry. A quarter of an hour afterwards, amidst an extraordinary turmoil of applause, Sybil Vane stepped onto the stage. Yes, she was certainly lovely to look at. One of the loveliest creatures, Lord Henry thought, that he had ever seen. There was something of the fawn in her shy grace and startled eyes. A faint blush, like the shadow of a rose in a mirror of silver, came to her cheeks as she glanced at the crowded, enthusiastic house. She stepped back a few paces, and her lips seemed to tremble. Basil Hallward leaped to his feet and began to applaud. Motionless, and as one in a dream sat Dorian Gray, gazing at her. Yet she was curiously listless. She showed no sign of joy when her eyes rested on Romeo. The few words she had to speak, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much," which mannerly devotion shows in this, with the brief dialogue that follows, was spoken in a thoroughly artificial manner. The voice was exquisite, but from the point of view of tone it was absolutely false. Dorian Gray grew pale as he watched her. He was puzzled and anxious. Neither of his friends dared to say anything to him. Yet they felt that the true test of any Juliet is the balcony scene of the second act. They waited for that. If she failed there was nothing in her. She looked charming as she came out in the moonlight. That could not be denied. But the staginess of her acting was unbearable, and grew worse as she went on. It was not nervousness. Indeed, so far from being nervous, she was absolutely self-contained. It was simply bad art. She was a complete failure. When the second act was over, there came a storm of hisses, and Lord Henry got up from his chair and put on his coat. "She's quite beautiful, Dorian, but she can't act. Let us go. I'm going to see the play through. I'm awfully sorry that I've made you waste an evening, Harry. I apologize to you both." "My dear Dorian, I should think Miss Vane was ill," interrupted Hallward. "We will come some other night." "I wish she were ill, but she seems to be simply careless and cold. She has entirely altered. Last night she was a great artist. This evening, she is merely a commonplace, mediocre actress." "Don't talk like that about anyone you love, Dorian. Love is a more wonderful thing than art." "They are both simply forms of imitation," remarked Lord Henry. "But do let us go. Dorian, you must not stay here any longer. It is not good for one's morals to see bad acting. Good heavens, my dear boy, don't look so tragic. Come to the club with Basil and myself. We will smoke cigarettes and drink to the beauty of Sybil Vane. She is beautiful. What more can you want?" "Go away, Harry. I want to be alone." The hot tears came to his eyes. His lips trembled, and rushing to the back of the box, he leaned up against the wall, hiding his face in his hands. "Let us go, Basil," said Lord Henry, and the two young men passed out together. As soon as it was over, Dorian Gray rushed behind the scenes into the green room. The girl was standing there alone, with a look of triumph on her face. "How badly I acted tonight, Dorian." "Horribly. It was dreadful. Are you ill? You have no idea what it was. You have no idea what I suffered." The girl smiled. "Dorian, you should have understood. But you understand now, don't you?" "Understand what?" "Why I was so bad tonight. Why I shall always be bad. Why I shall never act well again." He shrugged his shoulders. "You were ill, I suppose. When you were ill, you shouldn't act. You make yourself ridiculous. My friends were bored. I was bored." She seemed not to listen to him. She was transfigured with joy. "Dorian, Dorian," she cried, "before I knew you, acting was the one reality of my life. But tonight I saw through the hollowness, the silliness of the empty pageant in which I had always played. When I came on tonight, I could not understand how it was that everything had gone from me. I found that I could do nothing. Suddenly, it dawned on my soul what it all meant. I heard them hissing and I smiled. What could they know of love such as ours? Take me away, Dorian. Take me away with you. I hate the stage. I might mimic a passion that I do not feel, but I cannot mimic one that burns me like fire." He flung himself down on the sofa and turned away his face. "You have killed my love." She looked at him in wonder. Then she knelt down and pressed his hands to her lips. He drew them away, and a shudder ran through him. He leaped up and went to the door. "You used to stir my imagination. Now you don't even stir my curiosity. My God, how mad I was to love you. What a fool I have been. You are nothing to me now. I will never see you again. I will never mention your name. Without your art, you are nothing. I would have made you famous, splendid, magnificent. The world would have worshipped you, and you would have borne my name. What are you now? A third-rate actress? with a pretty face. The girl grew white and trembled. You are not serious, Dorian. You are acting. Acting. I leave that to you. You do it so well. A low moan broke from her, and she flung herself at his feet and lay there like a trampled flower. Dorian, Dorian, don't leave me. I am so sorry I didn't act well. I was thinking of you all the time. But I will try. Indeed, I will try. It came so suddenly across me, my love for you. Don't go away from me. I couldn't bear it. Oh, don't leave me. Don't leave me. Dorian Gray, with his beautiful eyes, looked down at her, and his chiseled lips curled in exquisite disdain. There is always something ridiculous about the emotions of people whom one has ceased to love. I'm going, he said at last. I don't wish to be unkind, but I can't see you again. You have disappointed me. She wept silently and made no answer but crept nearer, her hands stretched blindly out and appeared to be seeking for him. He turned on his heel and left the room. In a few moments, he was out of the theater. Where he went to, he hardly knew. He remembered wandering through dimly lit streets, past gaunt black-shadowed archways and evil-looking houses. He hailed a hansom and drove home. Having thrown his hat and cape on the table, his eye fell upon the portrait Basil Hallward had painted of him. He started back, as if in surprise. In the dim, arrested light that struggled through the cream-colored silk blinds, the face appeared to him to be a little changed. The expression looked different. One would have said that there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly strange. He winced, and taking up from the table an oval glass framed in ivory cupids, one of Lord Henry's many presents to him, glanced hurriedly into its polished depths. No line like that warped his red lips. What did it mean? It was not a mere fancy of his own. The thing was horribly apparent. He threw himself into a chair and began to think. Suddenly, there flashed across his mind what he had said in Basil Hallward's studio the day the picture had been finished. Surely his wish had not been fulfilled. Such things were impossible. It seemed monstrous even to think of them. And yet, there was the picture before him. What was he to say of that? It held the secret of his life and told his story. It had taught him to love his own beauty. Would it teach him to loathe his own soul? Its eyes met his own. A sense of infinite pity, not for himself, but for the painted image of himself, came over him. It had altered already, and would alter more. For every sin that he committed, a stain would fleck and wreck its fairness. But he would not sin. He would resist temptation. He would not see Lord Henry any more, would not at any rate listen to those subtle poisonous theories that in Basil Hallward's garden had first stirred within him the passion for impossible things. He would go back to Sybil Vane, make her amends, marry her, try to love her again. His life with her would be beautiful and pure. He got up from his chair and drew a large screen right in front of the portrait, shuddering as he glanced at it. How horrible, he murmured to himself, and he walked across to the window and opened it. The fresh morning air seemed to drive away all his somber passions. He thought only of Sybil. A faint echo of his love came back to him. He repeated her name over and over again. It was long past noon when there came a knock on the door, and he heard Lord Henry's voice outside. "My dear boy, I must see you. Let me in at once. I can't bear your shutting yourself up like this." He jumped up and unlocked the door. "I'm so sorry for it all, Dorian, but you must not think too much about it." "Do you mean Sybil Vane?" "Yes, of course," answered Lord Henry, sinking into a chair and slowly pulling off his yellow gloves. "It is dreadful from one point of view, but it was not your fault." "I have got through all that," said Dorian, shaking his head and smiling. "I'm perfectly happy now. I know what conscience is, to begin with. Don't sneer at it, Harry, any more. At least not before me, dear, my soul being hideous. A very charming artistic basis for ethics, Dorian. I congratulate you on it. But how are you going to begin? By marrying Sybil Vane. Marrying Sybil Vane? But my dear Dorian. Yes, Harry. I know what you're going to say. Something dreadful about marriage. Don't say it. Don't ever say things of that kind to me again. She's to be my wife. Your wife? Dorian, didn't you get my letter? I wrote to you this morning and sent the note down by my own man. Your letter? You know nothing, then? What do you mean? Lord Henry walked across the room, and sitting down by Dorian Gray, took both his hands in his own and held them tightly. Dorian, my letter, don't be frightened, was to tell you that Sybil Vane is dead. A cry of pain broke from the lad's lips, and he leaped to his feet, tearing his hands away from Lord Henry's grasp. Dead? Sybil dead? It is not true. It is a horrible lie. How dare you say it? It is quite true, Dorian. It is in all the morning papers. They found her lying dead on the floor of her dressing room. She had swallowed something by mistake, some dreadful thing they use at theaters. Harry, it is terrible. Oh, yes, it is very tragic, of course, but you mustn't let this thing get on your nerves. You must come and dine with me, and afterwards we will look in at the opera. It is a Patti night, and everybody will be there. Harry, why is it that I cannot feel this tragedy as much as I want to? I don't think I am heartless. Dorian, you said something to me the day before yesterday that seemed to me at the time to be merely fanciful, but that I see now is absolutely true. You said to me that Sybil Vane represented to you all the heroines of romance, that she was Desdemona one night and Ophelia the other, and that if she died as Juliet, she came to life as Imogen. The girl never really lived, and so she has never really died. The moment she touched actual life, she marred it, and it marred her, and so she passed away. Mourn for Ophelia, if you like, but don't waste your tears over Sybil Vane. We are only at the beginning of our friendship, Dorian, said Lord Henry, shaking him by the hand. Goodbye. I shall see you before 9:30, I hope. Remember, Patti is singing. He closed the door behind him. The evening darkened in the room. Noiselessly and with silver feet, the shadows crept in from the garden. The colors faded wearily out of things. Dorian Gray rushed to the screen and drew it back. No, there was no further change in the picture. It had received the news of Sybil Vane's death before he had known of it himself. A feeling of pain crept over him as he thought of the desecration that was in store for the fair face on the canvas. But if the picture was to alter, it was to alter. That was all. Why inquire too closely into it? For there would be a real pleasure in watching it. He would be able to follow his mind into its secret places. This portrait would be to him the most magical of mirrors, and when winter came upon it, he would still be standing where spring trembles on the verge of summer. When the blood crept from its face and left behind a pallid mask of chalk with leaden eyes, he would keep the glamour of boyhood. Not one blossom of his loveliness would ever fade. Not one pulse of his life would ever weaken. Like the gods of the Greeks, he would be strong and fleet and joyous. He drew the screen back into its former place in front of the picture, smiling as he did so, and passed into his dressing room, where his valet was already waiting for him. An hour later he was at the opera, and Lord Henry was leaning over his chair. It was on the 9th of November, the eve of his own 38th birthday, as he often remembered afterwards. He was walking home about 11 o'clock from Lord Henry's, where he had been dining, and was wrapped in heavy furs as the night was cold and foggy. At the corner of Grosvenor Square and South Audley Street, a man passed him in the mist, walking very fast, and with the collar of his grey ulster turned up. He had a bag in his hand. Dorian recognized him. It was Basil Hallward. A strange sense of fear, for which he could not account, came over him. He made no sign of recognition, and went on quickly in the direction of his own house. But Hallward had seen him. "Dorian, what an extraordinary piece of luck. I've been waiting for you in your library ever since 9 o'clock. Finally, I took pity on your tired servant and told him to go to bed as he let me out. I'm off to Paris by the midnight train, and I particularly wanted to see you before I left. Let me come in for a moment. I have something to say to you." "I shall be charmed, but won't you miss your train?" said Dorian Gray, as he passed up the steps and opened the door with his latchkey. "I have heaps of time. The train doesn't go till 12:15. It is only just 11. Hallward followed Dorian into the library. "My dear fellow, I want to speak to you seriously. Don't frown like that. You make it so much more difficult for me. I think it right that you should know that the most dreadful things are being said against you in London. I don't wish to know anything about them. I love scandals about other people, but scandals about myself don't interest me. They've not got the charm of novelty. They must interest you, Dorian. Mind you, I don't believe these rumors at all. At least I can't believe them when I see you. Sin is a thing that writes itself across a man's face. It cannot be concealed. But you, Dorian, with your pure, bright, innocent face and your marvelous, untroubled youth, I can't believe anything against you. And yet when I hear all these hideous things that people are whispering about you, I don't know what to say. Why is it, Dorian, that a man like the Duke of Berwick leaves the room of a club when you enter it? And why is your friendship so fatal to young men? There was that wretched boy in the Guards who committed suicide. You were his great friend. What about Lord Kent's only son and his career? Stop, Basil. You are talking about things of which you know nothing. You ask me why Berwick leaves a room when I enter it. It is because I know everything about his life, not because he knows anything about mine. You ask me about Henry Ashton and young Perth. Did I teach the one his vices and the other his debauchery? Dorian, there are other stories that you've been seen creeping at dawn out of dreadful houses and slinking in disguise into the foulest dens in London. Can they be true? Don't shrug your shoulders like that. Don't be so indifferent. You have a wonderful influence. Let it be for good, not for evil. Lord Gloucester was one of my greatest friends at Oxford. He showed me a letter that his wife had written to him when she was dying alone in a villa at Mentone. Your name was implicated in the most terrible confession I ever read. I told him that it was absurd, that I knew you thoroughly, and that you were incapable of anything of the kind. Know you? I wonder, do I know you? Before I could answer that, I should have to see your soul. To see my soul? Dorian Gray started up from the sofa, turning almost white from fear. Yes, answered Hallward, to see your soul, but only God can do that. You shall see it yourself. Tonight. Dorian seized a lamp from the table. Come. It is your own handiwork. Why shouldn't you look at it? You shall see the thing you fancy only God can see. Hallward started back. Come upstairs, Basil. I keep a diary of my life from day to day, and it never leaves the room in which it is written. I shall show it to you, if you come with me. He passed out of the room and began the ascent, Basil Hallward following close behind. They walked softly, as men do instinctively at night. The lamp cast fantastic shadows on the wall and staircase. A rising wind made some of the windows rattle. When they reached the top landing, Dorian set the lamp down on the floor, and taking out the key, he opened the door and went in. A cold current of air passed them, and the light shot up for a moment in a flame of murky orange. There was a damp odor of mildew. So you think that it is only God who sees the soul, Basil? Draw that curtain back, and you will see mine. You won't? Then I must do it myself. He tore the curtain from its rod and flung it on the ground. An exclamation of horror broke from the painter's lips as he saw in the dim light the hideous face on the canvas grinning at him. There was something in its expression that filled him with disgust and loathing. Good heavens! It was Dorian Gray's own face that he was looking at. But who had done it? He seemed to recognize his own brushwork, and the frame was his own design. The idea was monstrous. He seized the lighted candle and held it to the picture. In the left-hand corner was his own name, traced in long letters of bright vermilion. His own picture. What did it mean? Why had it altered? He turned and looked at Dorian Gray with the eyes of a sick man. The young man was leaning against the mantel shelf, watching him with that strange expression that one sees on the faces of those who are absorbed in a play when some great artist is acting. There was neither real sorrow in it, nor real joy. "What does this mean?" cried Hallward at last. "Years ago, in a mad moment, that even now I don't know whether I regret or not, I made a wish. Perhaps you would call it a prayer. I don't believe it is my picture. The room is damp. Mildew has got into the canvas. The paints I used had some mineral poison in them. I tell you, the thing is impossible. My God, if it is true, and this is what you have done with your life, why, you must be worse even than those who talk against you fancy you to be." He flung himself into the rickety chair that was standing by the table and buried his face in his hands. "Good God, Dorian, what a lesson. What an awful lesson. Pray, Dorian, pray. What is it that one has been taught to say in one's boyhood? Lead us not into temptation, forgive us our sins, wash away our iniquities." Dorian Gray turned slowly around. "It is too late, Basil." "Hush! Don't say that. You have done enough evil in your life. My God! Don't you see that accursed thing leering at us?" Suddenly, an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for Basil Hallward came over him, as though it had been suggested to him by the image on the canvas, whispered into his ear by those grinning lips. He loathed the man who was seated at the table. More than in his whole life he had ever loathed anything. He glanced wildly around. Something glimmered on the top of the painted chest that faced him. His eye fell on it. It was a knife that he had brought up some days before to cut a piece of cord, and had forgotten to take away with him. He moved slowly towards it. He seized it and turned round. Hallward stirred in his chair as if he was going to rise. He rushed at him and dug the knife into the great vein that is behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table and stabbing again and again. 3 times the outstretched arms shot up convulsively, waving grotesque, stiff-fingered hands in the air. Something began to trickle on the floor. He waited for a moment, still pressing the head down. Then he threw the knife on the table and listened. He could hear nothing but the drip, drip on the threadbare carpet. He opened the door and went out on the landing. The house was absolutely quiet. No one was about. Having locked the door behind him, he crept quietly downstairs. The woodwork creaked and seemed to cry out as if in pain. He stopped several times and waited. No. Everything was still. It was merely the sound of his own footsteps. He passed into the library, and for a quarter of an hour he walked up and down the room, biting his lip and thinking. Then he took down the blue book from one of the shelves and began to turn over the leaves. Alan Campbell, 152, Hertford Street, Mayfair. Yes, that was the man he wanted. At 10 o'clock the next morning, Alan Campbell walked in, looking very stern and rather pale, his pallor being intensified by his coal-black hair and dark eyebrows. "Alan, this is kind of you. I thank you for coming. Sit down." Campbell took a chair by the table, and Dorian sat opposite to him. The 2 men's eyes met. In Dorian's there was infinite pity. He knew that what he was going to do was dreadful. "Alan, in a locked room at the top of this house, A dead man is seated at a table. He has been dead 10 hours now. Don't stir, and don't look at me like that. Who the man is, why he died, how he died, are matters that do not concern you. What you have to do is this. Stop, Gray. I don't want to know anything further. Keep your horrible secrets to yourself. They don't interest me anymore. Alan, I'm awfully sorry for you, but you are the one man who is able to save me. You must change him and everything that belongs to him into a handful of ashes that I may scatter in the air. You're mad, Dorian. Ah, I was waiting for you to call me Dorian. You are mad, I tell you. Mad to imagine that I would raise a finger to help you. Mad to make this monstrous confession. I will have nothing to do with this matter, whatever it is. It was suicide, Alan. I am glad of that. But who drove him to it? You, I should fancy. Do you still refuse to do this for me? Of course I refuse. I will have absolutely nothing to do with it. Go to some of your friends. Don't come to me. We were friends once, Alan. Don't speak about those days, Dorian. They are dead. You refuse? Yes. I entreat you, Alan. It is useless. The same look of pity came into Dorian Gray's eyes. Then he stretched out his hand, took a piece of paper, and wrote something on it. He read it over twice, folded it carefully, and pushed it across the table. Having done this, he got up and went over to the window. Campbell looked at him in surprise, and then took up the paper and opened it. As he read it, his face became ghastly pale, and he fell back in his chair. After 2 or 3 minutes of terrible silence, Dorian turned round and came and stood behind him, putting his hand upon his shoulder. I am so sorry for you, Alan, but you leave me no alternative. I have a letter written already. Here it is. You see the address. If you don't help me, I must send it. If you don't help me, I will send it. You know what the result will be. But you are going to help me. Campbell buried his face in his hands, and a shudder passed through him. It was long after 7 when Campbell came back into the library. He was pale, but absolutely calm. I have done what you asked me to do, he muttered. And now goodbye. Let us never see each other again. You have saved me from ruin, Alan. I cannot forget that. As soon as Campbell had left, he went upstairs. There was a horrible smell of nitric acid in the room, but the thing that had been sitting at the table was gone. That evening at 8:30, exquisitely dressed and wearing a large buttonhole of Parma violets, Dorian Gray was ushered into Lady Narborough's drawing room by bowing servants. His forehead was throbbing with maddened nerves, and he felt wildly excited, but his manner as he bent over his hostess' hand was as easy and graceful as ever. But at dinner he could not eat anything. Plate after plate went away untasted. "Dorian," said Lord Henry at last, as the chaud-froid was being handed round, "what is the matter with you tonight? You're quite out of sorts." "I believe he's in love," cried Lady Narborough, "and that he's afraid to tell me for fear I should be jealous. He's quite right. I certainly should." "Dear Lady Narborough," murmured Dorian, smiling, "I have not been in love for a whole week. Not, in fact, since Madame de Farol left town." "How you men can fall in love with that woman," exclaimed the old lady, "I really cannot understand it. I remember her very well at Vienna 30 years ago, and how décolletée she was then." "She still is décolletée," Lord Henry answered. "And when she's in a very smart gown, she looks like an edition de luxe of a bad French novel. She's really wonderful and full of surprises. When her third husband died, her hair turned quite gold from grief." "It is a most romantic explanation," laughed the hostess. "But her third husband, Lord Henry? You don't mean to say Ferrol is the fourth?" "Upon my word, that is trop zèle. Trop d'audace, I tell her," said Dorian. "Oh, she is audacious enough for anything, my dear." The men laughed, and Mr. Chapman got up solemnly from the foot of the table and came up to the top. Dorian Gray changed his seat and went and sat by Lord Henry. "Dorian, you ran off very early last night. You left before 11. What did you do afterwards? Did you go straight home?" "Yes. No, I don't mean that. I didn't. I walked about. I forget what I did." "How inquisitive you are, Harry. You always want to know what one has been doing. Lord Henry shrugged his shoulders. My dear fellow, as if I cared. Let us go up to the drawing room. No sherry, thank you, Mr. Chapman. Something has happened to you, Dorian. Tell me what it is. You are not yourself tonight. Don't mind me, Harry. I'm irritable and out of temper. Make my excuses to Lady Narborough. I shan't go upstairs. I shall go home. I must go home. As he drove back to his own house, he was conscious that the sense of terror he thought he had strangled had come back to him. Lord Henry's casual questioning had made him lose his nerves for the moment, and he wanted his nerves still. As midnight was striking bronze blows upon the dusky air, Dorian Gray, dressed commonly and with a muffler wrapped round his throat, crept quietly out of the house. In Bond Street he found a hansom with a good horse. He hailed it, and in a low voice gave the driver an address. Lying back in the hansom, with his hat pulled over his forehead, Dorian Gray watched with listless eyes the sordid shame of the great city, and now and then he repeated to himself the words that Lord Henry had said to him: to cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul. Finally, they drew up at the top of a dark lane. Dorian started and peered round. This will do, he said, and having got out hastily, he walked quickly in the direction of the quay and reached a small, shabby house that was wedged in between two gaunt factories. In one of the top windows stood a lamp. He stopped and gave a peculiar knock. The door opened quietly, and he went in without saying a word to the squat, misshapen figure that flattened itself into the shadow as he passed. In one corner, with his head buried in his arms, a sailor sprawled over a table, and by the tawdrily painted bar that ran across one complete side stood two haggard women mocking an old man who was brushing the sleeves of his coat with an expression of disgust. "He thinks he's got red ants on him," laughed one of them as Dorian passed by. The man looked at her in terror and began to whimper. At the end of the room there was a little staircase leading to a darkened chamber. As Dorian hurried up the steps, the heavy odor of opium met him. He heaved a deep breath, and his nostrils quivered with pleasure. When he entered, a young man with smooth yellow hair who was bending over a lamp, lighting a long thin pipe, looked up at him and nodded in a hesitating manner. "You here, Adrian?" muttered Dorian. "Where else should I be? None of the chaps will speak to me now. I don't care. I think I've had too many friends." Dorian winced and looked round at the grotesque things that lay in such fantastic postures on the ragged mattresses. "I'm going on to the other place," he said after a pause. "On the wharf?" "Yes. That madcat is sure to be there. They won't have her in this place now." Dorian shrugged his shoulders. "I'm sick of women who love one. Women who hate one are much more interesting." "Much the same. Good night, then." "Good night." Dorian walked to the door with a look of pain in his face. As he drew the curtain aside, a hideous laugh broke from the painted lips of one of the women. "There goes the devil's bargain," she cried. "Don't call me that." She snapped her fingers. "Prince Charming is what you like to be called, ain't it?" she yelled after him. The drowsy sailor leapt to his feet as she spoke and looked wildly round. He rushed out as if in pursuit. Dorian Gray hurried along the quay through the drizzling rain. His meeting with Adrian Singleton had strangely moved him. Yet after all, what did it matter to him? One's days were too brief to take the burden of another's errors on one's shoulders. He quickened his step as he went, but as he darted aside into a dim archway, he felt himself suddenly seized from behind, and before he had time to defend himself, he was thrust back against the wall with a brutal hand round his throat. He struggled madly for life, and by a terrible effort wrenched the tightening fingers away. In a second he heard the click of a revolver, and saw the gleam of a polished barrel pointing straight at his head, and the dusky form of a short, thick-set man facing him. "What do you want?" he gasped. "Keep quiet," said the man. "If you stir, I shoot you." "What have I done to you?" "You wrecked the life of Sybil Vane, and Sybil Vane was my sister. She killed herself. Her death is at your door. I swore I would kill you in return. For years I've sought you. I had no clue, no trace.
I knew nothing of you but the pet name she used to call you. I heard it tonight by chance. Make your peace with God, for tonight you are going to die."
Dorian Gray grew sick with fear.
"I never knew her. I never heard of her. You're mad. You had better confess your sin, for as sure as I am James Vane, you are going to die."
Paralyzed with terror, Dorian did not know what to do. Suddenly, a wild hope flashed across his brain.
"Stop," he cried. "How long ago is it since your sister died? Quick, tell me."
18 years.
"Why do you ask me? What do years matter?"
18 years. 18 years. Set me under the lamp and look at my face." James Vane hesitated for a moment, not understanding what was meant. Then he seized Dorian Gray and dragged him from the archway. Dim and wavering as was the wind-blown light, yet it served to show him the hideous error, as it seemed, into which he had fallen. For the face of the man he had sought to kill had all the bloom of boyhood, all the unstained purity of youth. He seemed little more than a lad of 20 summers. It was obvious that this was not the man who had destroyed his sister's life.
My God, I would have murdered you. Forgive me, sir. I was deceived."
Let this be a warning to you, not to take vengeance into your own hands." Dorian turned on his heel and went slowly down the street. "There is no use your telling me that you're going to be good," cried Lord Henry, dipping his white fingers into a red copper bowl filled with rose water. "You're quite perfect. Pray, don't change." "I can't bear this, Harry. You mock at everything. I want to be better. I'm going to be. Tell me something about yourself. What is going on in town? I've not been to the club for days. The people are still discussing poor Basil's disappearance. I suppose in about a fortnight we shall be told that he's been seen in San Francisco. It is an odd thing, but everyone who disappears is said to be seen at San Francisco. It must be a delightful city and possess all the attractions of the next world." Dorian said nothing, but rose from the table and, passing into the next room, sat down to the piano and let his fingers stray across the white and black ivory of the keys. After the coffee had been brought in, he stopped and, looking over at Lord Henry, said, "Harry, did it ever occur to you that Basil was murdered?" Lord Henry yawned. "Basil was very popular and always wore a Waterbury watch. Why should he have been murdered? Play me a nocturne, Dorian, and as you play, tell me, in a low voice, how you have kept your youth. You must have some secret. I am only 10 years older than you are, and I am wrinkled and worn and yellow. You are really wonderful, Dorian. You have never looked more charming than you do tonight. You remind me of the day I saw you first. I'm so glad that you have never done anything, never carved a statue or painted a picture. Life has been your art. Why have you stopped playing, Dorian? Do stay. You have never played so well as tonight." "It is because I'm going to be good," he answered, smiling. "I am a little changed already." "You cannot change to me, Dorian. You and I will always be friends. Come round tomorrow. The park is quite lovely now. I don't think there have been such lilacs since the year I met you." "Very well. I shall be here at 11. Good night, Harry." As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, as if he had something more to say. Then he sighed and went out. When he reached home, he found his servant waiting up for him. He sent him to bed and threw himself down on the sofa in the library. He felt a wild longing for the unstained purity of his boyhood, his rose-white boyhood, as Lord Henry had once called it. The curiously carved mirror that Lord Henry had given to him so many years ago now was standing on the table, and the white-limbed cupids laughed round it as of old. He took it up, as he had done on that night of horror, when he had first noted the change in the fatal picture, and with wild, tear-dimmed eyes looked into its polished shield. Once someone who had terribly loved him had written to him a mad letter, ending with these idolatrous words,
The world is changed because you were made of ivory and gold. The curves of your lips rewrite history. The phrases came back to his memory, and he repeated them over and over to himself. Then he loathed his own beauty, and flinging the mirror on the floor, crushed it into silver splinters beneath his heel. It was his beauty that had ruined him, his beauty and the youth that he had prayed for. But for those two things, his life might have been free from stain. A new life. That was what he wanted. That was what he was waiting for. Surely he had begun it already. He began to wonder if the portrait in the locked room had changed. Surely it was not still so horrible as it had been. He took the lamp from the table and crept upstairs. Yes, he would be good, and the hideous thing that he had hidden away would no longer be a terror to him. He felt as if the load had already been lifted from him. He went in quietly, locking the door behind him as was his custom, and dragged the purple hanging from the portrait. A cry of pain and indignation broke from him. He could see no change, save that in the eyes there was a look of cunning, and in the mouth a curved wrinkle of the hypocrite. The thing was still loathsome, more loathsome if possible than before, and the scarlet dew that spotted the hand seemed brighter and more like blood newly spilt. Then he trembled. Why was the red stain larger than it had been? It seemed to have crept like a horrible disease over the wrinkled fingers. There was blood on the painted feet, as though the thing had dripped. Blood, even on the hand that had not held the knife. This murder, was it to dog him all his life? Was he always to be burdened by his past? Was he to confess? Never. There was only one bit of evidence left against him, the picture itself. That was evidence. He would destroy it. Once it had given him pleasure to watch it changing and growing old. Of late he had felt no such pleasure. It had kept him awake at night. When he had been away, he had been filled with terror lest other eyes should look upon it. It had brought melancholy across his passions. It had been like conscience to him. Yes, it had been conscience. He would destroy it. He looked round and saw the knife that had stabbed Basil Hallward. It was bright and glistened. As it had killed the painter, so it would kill the painter's work and all that meant. It would kill the past, and when that was dead, he would be free. He would kill this monstrous soul life, and without its hideous warnings, he would be at peace. He seized the thing and stabbed the picture with it. There was a cry heard, and a crash. The cry was so horrible in its agony that the frightened servants woke and crept out of their rooms. Finally, when they entered, they found, hanging upon the wall, a splendid portrait of their master as they had last seen him, in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress, with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not till they had examined the rings that they recognized who it was.